Welcome to the Global Justice Report, an online production of the Center for Global Justice. I'm Cliff Durand, your host for today's program. The Center for Global Justice, El Centro para la Justicia Global, is a multinational and bilingual research center located in San Miguel de Allende, Mexico. The center is devoted to research and learning for a better world and empowering a solidarity economy. Due to the pandemic, we have discontinued our in-person events and have instituted these online webinars instead. Without our previous revenue generating programs, we now depend on your donations to support these webinars and to be able to continue to pay our Mexican staff. You can donate at our website, www.globaljusticecenter.org. Any amount is appreciated. We are pleased today to have with us as our speaker Radhika Desai, who will be speaking on prospects for socialism in the 21st century. Now, what are the prospects for socialism in the US or elsewhere? And what kind of socialism? After the failures of socialism in the 20th century, many are rethinking how to build socialism today. Radhika Desai is a professor at the Department of Political Studies and director Geopolitical Economy Research Group at the University of Manitoba, Winnipeg. She is the author of Geopolitical Economy After U.S. Hegemony, Globalization and Empire. She heads up the International Manifesto Group. She will discuss prospects for socialism in the U.S. as well as China, Cuba, and elsewhere. Socialist economic construction continues to offer the most viable alternative to the capitalist crisis. But how to build it is the question. So without further ado, let me hand the floor over to Desai and welcome you to our webinar.
Thanks very much, Cliff. And I think Mark had a question about translation in the chat, or sorry, Jack had a question about translation. So maybe you want to respond to that. Okay, let me just get started. So I have entitled my talk as Cliff suggested, 21st Century Socialism, but an alternative title could easily be Socialism as if Imperialism Mattered. What I have to say today is based on a lot of the research and writing that I've done in the last decade and more. Particularly in 2013, I published a book called Geopolitical Economy. The subtitle was After US Hegemony, Globalization and Empire, which takes aim at what I call cosmopolitan views of the world economy and emphasizes the importance of nation states, both in understanding the world economy and in understanding it in a Marxist fashion. I still believe that Marxism provides among the most important and best guides to try to analyzing what's happening in our world today. So, yeah, I think some people are having difficulty with the audio. I don't know. I don't know what to do about it, Jack. I think you just, yeah. Sorry.
He should turn off his video and his computer and sign on again. Turn it on again.
Yeah, maybe that would be better. Yeah, because maybe you have something on your computer, because I don't think anybody else has a double play problem. Anyway, so let me continue. So what I have to say today is based on a number of things. One of them is geopolitical economy. I've also have extensive works writing both on understanding imperialism as well as Marxist theory, and you'll see how it's woven into what I have to say. Thirdly, it has to do with the International Manifesto Group, particularly the manifesto, which we published last September, which was entitled Through Pluripolarity Towards Socialism, a manifesto. And so that will be woven into it. And finally, I've just completed a new book called Capitalism, Coronavirus and War, a Geopolitical Economy, which tries to understand the state of the developed capitalist countries, particularly what I call the two leading neoliberal financialized capitalist countries, that is to say the United States and the UK, and how low they have sunk in terms of having an extremely malfunctioning productive system, a highly financialized economy, instead mismanaging the COVID crisis extremely maladroitly. I mean, to the extent of being both at the same time, what's the word for it? Well, both murderous as well as shambolic. And, how did we get here? How do you get to a situation where, for example, you have people like Trump and Johnson being elected to high office, etc. So this really indicates an extremely deep and structural malaise. And in all of these works, I attribute this malaise to 40 years of neoliberalism going back to the early 1980s. But I also point out that I'm not one of those who says neoliberal capitalism in order to suggest that there is any other kind. I believe that neoliberal capitalism is the only kind that is possible today if capitalism is not to incur the danger of being turned into some kind of socialism. So if we want to keep capitalism, that's what we are going to get. Otherwise, we are looking at various forms of reformed capitalism, which could become the road to socialism. For socialists, that's good news, but it's something, a clarity that you have to bear in mind. So that's just as a preface. Now let me, oh, and by the way, if you want to look for the manifesto, you'll find it at www.internationalmanifesto.org. So let me just divide my my remarks into two big parts, a theoretical part and a historical part. So in terms of what I have to say, yes, thank you. In terms of what I have to say, what I want to basically do is I want to ask, how have most people in Western countries in particular expected socialism to come about, how it has actually come about, and why that this requires us to reflect on what is wrong with our understanding and therefore rectify it. So basically, if you think about it, the leading traditions of Marxism, particularly in the Western countries, and certainly in the English-speaking world, are what we would call a certain type of Western Marxism. And according to this Western Marxism, the general idea is that capitalism is most highly developed in the advanced capitalist countries, in the richest parts of the world, in the imperial countries of the world. And the idea is that the socialism will come about by working classes there organizing and making a revolution. Obviously, since in recent times, there is not much sign of working classes taking up the cudgel and making revolution. The revolution is pushed back into the distant future. And also, when people look at the what we may call actually existing socialisms, these actually existing socialisms are regarded as some kind of a deformation, a mistake, something that, perhaps should never have been attempted, etc., etc. So there is basically disdain for what happened in the Soviet Union, what happened in the People's Republic of China, and more broadly, indeed, until fairly recently, Cuba was something of an exception, but increasingly now you also see that substantial parts of the left are also taking a fairly anti-Cuba position, which should concern us all. So this is how most Western leftists and even Western Marxists expect socialism to occur. In reality, of course, if you think about it, socialism has actually, beginning with the Russian Revolution in 1917, socialism has not broken out in the advanced capitalist countries, but on the contrary, on the peripheries of capitalism, from Russia to China, Vietnam, Cuba, etc., you name it, and you can say there are all these attempts to try to build socialism outside what we may call the homelands of capitalism. And inevitably, because they have taken place outside the homelands, these socialist revolutions have always had a certain national character, especially particularly starting with China, Vietnam, etc. They have also been national revolutions, and in a very critical sense, anti-imperialist revolutions. So this has been the actual record of imperialism. Sorry, of socialism. And socialism has also historically been as important in terms of opposing imperialism as it has been important in terms of opposing capitalism. So how do we try to understand this divergence? So first I will speak theoretically, and then I will speak historically. So to take the theoretical viewpoint, I would say that what I've been proposing, most people who study Marxism will understand that Marxism is not economics, it's sort of political economy and critical political economy and so on. And I certainly agree with that, but it's not enough. And in my writing, I have put forward a larger perspective on socialism, which I call, and generally of understanding the capitalist world, that I call geopolitical economy. That is to say that political economy, that is to say, understanding capitalism within a society, understanding class struggles, etc., has to be accompanied by understanding the international dimension of capitalism. Many people may say that, somehow that by pointing to this, I'm adding to Marxism, but I'm not. A large part of my writing on geopolitical economy has been devoted to showing that this understanding is already extant in Marx, in the writings of Marx and Engels, and in the writing of the later Marxists, particularly the next generation, such as Lenin or Bukharin or Hilferding, and so on and so forth. That these people took it for granted that there was an international dimension that was not only important, in fact, in many ways, it could be determining. Certainly, the Bolsheviks found out that, in fact, it could be determining. So in geopolitical economy, I've unearthed an understanding of Marxism, or the parts of Marxism, which show that it is not just classes that are agents of socialism, but also nations. This understanding is in Marx and Engels, and I unearth it and I show it. More recently, I elaborated on one particular aspect of it at some length, because, of course, as you know, capital is not a finished work. It was part of the first volume of many that were planned. Engels then published 2 more volumes, but that was itself not enough, and Marx had planned a whole range of other volumes. And what he would have written in those volumes, we can glean from other writings that he left aside. And in the Grundrisse in particular, I point to a particular passage in which Marx is commenting on the American mercantilist economist, Henry Carey, in which he really displays, so if you're a mercantilist economist, clearly you think nations are important. So what did Marx have to say about that? And by unearthing that, I show that Marx actually understood there to be an international struggle between countries, just as he understood that there would be class struggle between capitalist classes and working people. So in the say, so and I also, for example, there's this wonderful quote going back to the mid 1840s where Marx says, about the people who are people who he's opposing in the debates on free trade. He says, if these gentlemen do not understand how one nation can grow rich by exploiting another nation, how are they to understand how one class can grow rich by exploiting another class? So very clearly for Marx, these were side by side. And if one reads then further Marx's writings on India, on Ireland, on China, and many other countries which he regarded as being oppressed by other countries, I think we see that Marx had a very clearly anti-imperialist point of view. So this is the understanding I've developed in geopolitical economy. I also continue developing it in my more recent book, which will come out in November, called Capitalism, Coronavirus, and War. That's one sort of broad set of points I wanted to make. Now, the reason why the international dimension of capitalism is important is because capitalism by its very nature is expansionist. That is to say, although capitalism cannot live without having a nation state as its basis, it necessarily overspills the boundaries of the nation state. And in fact, it uses the nation state as its instrument for imposing its domination elsewhere. So this is simply a long-winded way of saying capitalism is necessarily imperialist. And capitalism is necessarily imperialist because capitalism is contradictory. That is to say, it embodies a number of contradictions, things that capitalism, by contradiction, we simply mean that capitalism requires certain things to be present without being able to furnish them for itself. So for example, capitalism constantly requires constantly expanding markets, while at the same time, its own logics require it to constrain markets as well by not paying the producers the full value of what they produce, which is part of the exploitation that we know about. So beginning with these contradictions, and in fact, I've thought a great deal systemically about the contradictions of capitalism, and I feel that it arises in fact, I can share my screen right now and just show you how I think about these things. Share screen. Here we go. So if you can see this table, what you can see here is that there are a number of realms of capitalist production. In capitalist production cannot take place unless there are things change in all of these realms, okay? And of these two, production and realization, are the core realms of what Marx would have called value production, which is essentially the core of capitalism. So things have to be produced via exploitation, surplus value has to be extracted, and then whatever is produced has to be sold in the market and its value realized in the market. So these are the core realms of value production. But in order for these two core realms to do their work, you need to rejig the realms of money, finance, our relations with nature, to create a state and then interstate relations of a particular sort in order for capitalism to exist. So all of these realms are important for capitalism. And in each of these realms, contradictions arise in two different forms. One is the intra-class form, which results out of the competition among capitalist classes. So, and the other is interclass, or that is to say, due to class struggle between capitalists and those that they exploit. So, for example, I won't go through all of these, but so, for example, in the production realm, because capitalists compete, they tend to lead to a tendency for the rate of profit to fall. Whereas in the realm of production, if, for example, workers do become highly organized, there can be instances in which they can squeeze profits. Similarly, the most important intra-class core contradiction is the tendency of the rate of profit to fall. And similarly, the most important interclass contradiction is the tendency to overproduction, the tendency of capitalist production to expand beyond the point where there are markets for them. And I'll just show one other thing, which is that at the international realm, you can have uneven and combined capitalist development. That is to say, because capitalism always needs foreign markets, foreign sources of raw material, foreign avenues for investment, for surplus capital, commodities, etc., etc. Because of this, it gives rise to the logic of uneven and combined development, where dominant countries try to impose their dominion over, or they try to subordinate other territories, and very often where those territories can, they fight back and they do not submit. So the process of uneven and combined development has led historically both to the rise of new capitalist countries, as for example in the industrialization of Germany or Japan or even the United States, at a time when Britain was the supreme power dominating the world market. So they engaged in various forms of combined development, by which I mean state-led protection, development, etc. And they developed against the dominance of the UK. And then in a later era, what you began to get is essentially the dialectic of uneven and combined development began to take the form of imperialism on the one hand, the imposition and the retention of uneven development by the powerful countries, such as the developed capitalist countries, and the opposition to them increasingly taking the form of socialism or some kind of socialistic national development. So that's what I call socialist combined development, which begins in 1917. And so what this also shows you is that socialism, the rise of socialism, is in a certain sense part of what capitalism itself has elicited, because capitalism offers to such a large part of the world's population a future that is extremely paltry, it is extremely undesirable, where they have been able to organize and fight back. You've had to have attempts to build socialism in one form or another. So I hope that gives you some idea. So basically what I argue is that capitalism is contradictory, and these contradictions give rise to the expansionism and then the resistance to that expansionism, which since 1917 has also taken socialist forms. And this is how it's important to understand socialism. So that's why I also believe that capitalism and imperialism are intertwined like this. You cannot have the one without the other. You cannot have merely capitalism. And this is a huge problem, which I'll come to in a second. And one other thing I should point out is that understanding capitalism as as Marx understood, as contradictory value production, is not the way in which the bulk of the Marxist tradition today understands it. And I mean by that particularly the Western Marxist tradition, because when you look at Western Marxism, particularly what's called Marxist economics, you find something very peculiar. You find a tradition which says, first of all, Marxist value analysis does not work. Why? Because it has a transformation problem. It cannot transform values into prices, so throw it all out. Secondly, it says demand is not a problem. Capitalists can keep on producing it. Capitalism is not constrained by the absence of markets. And finally, they say that so in the case of demand, they claim that Marx never said this, which is not true, because I have shown chapter and verse that Marx says that in volume 1, in volume 2, in volume 3, in the Grundrisse, you name it, Marx says it everywhere. In the case of the tendency of the rate of profit to fall, I'm not even sure whether they read Marx, because the reasons they trot out to say that, the reason they give is, capitalists wouldn't invest if their profits were going down. You thought Marx didn't realize that? I mean, Marx has long passages refuting that argument. So do these people even read Capital or what? I don't know. But this is what you find. So essentially what passes for Marxist economics are these sorts of things. Transformation problem. Marx was wrong about demand. Marx never said there was a demand problem, and Marx was wrong about falling rates of profit. All of this is complete bunkum. And you begin to wonder, why do you get this? And I investigated this very deeply, and I found that it actually goes back to the late 19th century. So within a decade or so of the publication of the first volume of Capital, you already get a huge malfunction in the Marxist assimilation of Marx's legacy, of Marx's writing. And what is that problem? The problem is this. Marx published Capital, first volume of Capital in 1867. Already by that time, I mean, it's not that Marx, the fame of Capital was already great by that time, but the problem was that up to that point, the tradition that had understood capitalism was the tradition of classical political economy. And classical political economy, even before Marx, especially its best representatives, such as Ricardo, tended to be wedded to the idea that only labor produces value. And this had already led to the rise of Ricardian Marxist traditions, that people said that if only labor produces value, why are all these fat cats getting so rich and why are we so poor? Quite rightly. Or what Marx and Engels did is they gave it another level of sophistication and they completed the analysis, which Ricardo wrestled with, but he could not actually complete. So anyway, what I'm simply saying is that classical political economy was already a problem. It was about to become a bigger problem with Marx's completing its understanding, and fully filling it out and resolving its problems. And at that point, you needed a much better way of justifying capitalism, and a better way came along. We call it today neoclassical economics. Now, neoclassical economics and Marxism are completely antithetical. They're opposed to each other. So you would have thought that Marxists would have reacted to the arrival of neoclassical economics by, getting out their boxing gloves and saying, okay, we're going to fight you. Instead, unfortunately, partly I think because so many people came to Marxism after having already been educated in neoclassical tradition, which fairly quickly became fairly widespread, they began to pursue what Nikolai Bukharin called a policy of theoretical reconciliation with neoclassical economics. Now, this was not a complete surrender. Obviously, they pointed out that neoclassical economics gets a lot of things wrong, but broadly speaking, they accepted the framework. And what passes for Marxist economics since that time, since the 1880s even, I would say, is an attempt to fit Marxism into the antithetical framework of neoclassical economics. And because you can never fit it, it's an unending enterprise. People keep writing books and articles and more books and articles about these same problems again and again, going around the same issues, realize what is it, a transformation problem, demand problem, rate of profit falling, etc. And they keep churning out the same old stuff. They reformulate the problems each time. Now, part of the reason for going through all this is that because Western Marxism does not understand this, does not understand contradictions, does not understand capitalism, does not even understand value, I would argue. They don't understand how central contradictions are to capitalism. And if they don't understand that, naturally, they dismiss imperialism. They say, oh, imperialism is very bad. What Belgium did in Congo or what Britain did in India are very, very bad, but it's not necessary to capitalism. Unfortunately, this also gives rise to another huge problem. What these economists, these so-called Marxists, think is the Promethean productive capacity of capitalism is actually a result of imperialism. Why are rich countries rich? Not because capitalism is so fantastically productive, but because they are imperialist. If you do not recognize that, there is a big problem. Okay. So, and finally, one final thing I would say is that because of this blind spot of imperialism, they have also failed to understand the extent to which imperialism has permitted a level of reformism in first world countries, which has tended to de-radicalize working class movements. I'm not necessarily saying that working class movements should have shunned all reform. Of course, every working class must work for a reform where it's possible. But that does not mean they should blind themselves to the reality of imperialism. And unfortunately, a combination of the reforms that have been possible and the intellectual dead end of Marxist economics has resulted in a mutually self-reinforcing thing where Western Marxists tend to not understand imperialism, do not understand, therefore, the necessity of socialism outside the core of the capitalist countries, and therefore have no respect for the already 100-year-long history of socialism in the world today. So that's what I want to say in theoretical terms. Now, then let me go very quickly in historical terms. What do I want to say? So, there's also another lecture that I like giving. I do teach Marxism, and I love giving this lecture in particular because people have spilled a lot of ink on understanding what Marx and Engels meant when they referred to pre-capitalist social formations, feudalism and primitive communism and blah, blah, and so on. And they have written a fair bit about this. So, and I've studied these quite closely, and I feel that as you know, Hobsbawm also wrote a very fine introduction to pre-capitalist social formations, that section of the Grundrisse where they discuss these things. So combining these insights, what I feel I argue, what I'd like to argue is that Marx and Engels are not trying to say that, history has these stages, first you get primitive communism and then slavery and feudalism and capitalism and socialism. No. What Marx is trying to do is he's saying that capitalism is so unnatural because it relies on separating humankind from the means of their labor, namely the earth, the bits of earth to which they have historically been attached. It separates them. And he says, so all these historical reflections are just in order to answer one question. What has to happen? How many things have to go wrong before we get to a form of society which relies on the separation of human beings from their means of livelihood, rather than from their unity? What are all the things that have to go wrong? And he's not trying to give some overall question. He's just tracing the key turning points that he knows about. I should say they know about, Marx and Engels both did this, that they know about, in order to show that these are some of the main stages through which we got to this unfortunate situation. And there also they are resisting another tendency which is very big in their time, because the Enlightenment thinkers love to portray capitalism as natural and feudalism as artificial and so on. And they're saying, look folks, capitalism is the most unnatural form of social production humankind has ever had the misfortune to chance on. So so this is the starting point of understanding everything about capitalism and revolutions, because, I argue, my colleague Henry Heller and I argue in the introduction that we wrote to a volume on revolutions, which we published as a result of a conference we did in 1917. We wanted to mark, of course, the Russian Revolution, but also we wanted to respect all the revolutions that have occurred and put these socialist revolutions in a line of understanding with other revolutions, including bourgeois revolutions. And one of the things we ended up saying is that actually capitalism is intimate, has a deep intimacy with revolutions, because if you think about it, because it's such an unnatural system, you need to revolutionize society root and branch to bring it into existence. Then everybody realizes what a mess they've made, and then you need a revolution to take it out of existence. So capitalism is deeply connected with revolutions. You didn't have a feudal revolution in the same sense, because feudalism was pretty bad. I'm not saying let's go back to feudalism, but it was not quite so unnatural as capitalism was. So capitalism is deeply unnatural and it is intimate with revolutions. And that's why to this day, communities in Mexico or elsewhere in Latin America are still fighting capitalism in the name of their ancient rights to their land, to their community, to their national rights, etc., etc. And I think we have to understand the resistance to capitalism in a broad and sympathetic way like this, because this is also a form. And of course, we know from the writings of E.P. Thompson and others that the resistance to capitalism among working people took many forms and goes back a very, very long way from the beginnings of capitalism. But let's shorten our historic time period to basically, but let's skip over even the Paris Commune and say, okay, 1917, in the midst of a war, you have a revolution, and that's the beginning of the history of socialism on this planet in some meaningful sense. Now, by the time this happens, one of the things that is often forgotten is that by the time the Russian Revolution occurs, you already have a big, what's the word for it? A big change in capitalism. In the run-up to the First World War, you have a number of writings on imperialism, Lenin's writings, Bukharin's, Hilferding's, etc., and they all seem to converge on some sort of understanding that somehow capitalism has reached a stage of maturity. And in retrospect, particularly, in the 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, we tended to dismiss this because, the thing is, capitalism seemed to have come back after the Second World War. And so, what are these people talking about, etc., etc. We can come back to that in the question and answer, but let me go through this now relatively quickly, because otherwise I will talk for too long. What was the maturity? In fact, they were right. Lenin and others were right to say capitalism had matured, because basically by the 1870s, capitalism was already entering into what we may call the second industrial revolution, the era of monopoly capital, which over the next several decades really matured. And this had already, to me, if you understand Marx properly, this had already essentially finished the historical utility of capitalism. Because what is the historical utility of capitalism? Capitalism is pretty bad. It does everything in a ham-handed, brutal and chaotic way. But Marx said, okay, even if it is so, but at least if nobody stops it, it will socialize labor. So in the early competitive phase of capitalism, capitalism forcibly, brutally, chaotically socializes labor between firms. So different firms produce different things. Then you get a new phase in the development of capitalism, which socializes labor within giant firms, because each firm is a giant complex division of labor, which is no longer in the market, but the division of labor takes place under the authoritative command of the capitalist. So you already have, by this time, enormous enterprises that are already vast planned economies. Because that's what a big corporation is. It's a vast planned economy. Okay, let me underline that. Okay, so capitalism is already mature, as I say, there is a financial aspect to this. So Hilferding, for example, develops this idea, and he says that capitalism inherits a pre-capitalist form of finance, usurious form of finance, and it transforms that into a form of finance that can service production, which only has developed in places like Germany, but not in England, because England is still living with the old type of finance. But I'll just refer to that and leave it aside for now. We'll come back to that when we discuss financialization. Okay, so capitalism is mature, and the maturation of capitalism, thanks to the uneven and combined development of capitalism in many different major capitalist countries, leads to the First World War, because these guys are not sitting around having nice relations with one another. They are sitting around competing with one another for markets, for economic territory, for empire, etc. This culminates in the First World War and creates what Arno Meyer calls a 30 years crisis, because of course, the First World War is an imperialist war. So is the Second World War. Although in the Second World War, matters are complicated by the involvement and the critical contribution of communist forces in both the Asian and the European theaters, with the Soviet Union and communist Chinese forces making a critical contribution to the victory of the Allies. But still, at its origin, it's an imperialist war. So this entire 30-year period of imperialist war, destruction, Great Depression, you name it, people actually thought towards its end that capitalism would end, because capitalism had made such a mess of things. Big wars, Great Depression, it had nothing really to stand on. Keynes thought so, Polanyi thought so, even American policymakers thought so. But American policymakers decided to mount a a counteroffensive, and they did, but we'll leave that aside. But people like Keynes or Polanyi were not entirely wrong, because the world that emerged from the Second World War leaned distinctly leftwards. Think about it. You already have vast continents given over to communism, namely Russia and China, Eastern Europe as well. Number two, in the newly decolonized third world countries, you begin to get attempts to develop these countries and develop their productive capacities, which are also leaning distinctly leftwards, in the sense that they are looking to the socialist experiences of Russia and China to develop their economies. And finally, in the first world countries themselves, you get Keynesian welfare states that the capitalists of those countries have to be dragged into kicking and screaming, but they are dragged into it because there is no other way of keeping capitalism going. Okay, so actually you got the period of the golden age of so-called capitalist growth is only possible because already capitalism is ringed around with these socialistic measures, welfare states, macroeconomic management for full employment, etc., capital controls, you name it, we can discuss them. This enables the expansion of demand that creates the golden age. But eventually, because the underlying capitalist character of these economies is not extinguished, it leads to its own crisis of overproduction. By the 1970s, you have a crisis, and at that point, the world is at least the first world countries are at a crossroads. You can continue to deepen socialistic reform of the sort you began to undertake in the hope of essentially carrying forward in the same trend, and if the left had been strong enough, it could have done so. In fact, there was a lot of contestation in the 70s, but the left was not strong either intellectually or politically for some of the reasons we have already noted, including accepting that somehow capitalism was, it had this Promethean productivity. It's a Schumpeterian conception of capitalism, not a Marxist one. And on the other hand, you can say, well, these socialistic reforms were the problem, roll them back and we will get capitalist nirvana. Capitalism will recover its mojo. It will develop the economy till, the cows come home and we'll have no problem. The second option was taken, but the problem with the second option was, and there are many things I could say here, but I'm going to keep it short by saying the problem with the second option was that the theory of neoliberalism, neoclassical economics, is based on competitive capitalism. But we are already living in monopoly capitalism. Giving monopoly capitalism the freedom is not going to recreate competition. It is only going to not going to recreate the virtues of competition. It's only going to embolden and strengthen the vices of monopoly. And that's indeed what we got. So the only thing that was has been thriving over the past four decades is monopoly and financialization. There has been no recovery in the rate of investment. There has been no recovery in the growth levels, etc. There is basically, we have a sickly and malingering capitalism. The only thing that is thriving is finance and financialization, which is actually not even like productively. It's not about production. It's about sucking away incomes of those who are actually producing anything, whether it is the state or ordinary, workers or small business people or whoever. So this is the kind of malingering capitalism we have. Neoliberalism, the underlying problem of demand was not solved, but exacerbated by neoliberalism. Profitability has not recovered. In fact, a large part of financialization is driven by the search for higher profits, which cannot be had in the existing capitalist system. So, and of course, we have seen skyrocketing levels of inequality of a sort that nobody thought people would ever put up with. I mean, back in the late 19th century, when the populist era first emerged in the United States, inequality was a fraction of what it is today. So you begin to wonder. So basically, the long and short of it, I'm going to bring my lecture to an end by simply saying that essentially, in many countries around the world, people have been ready to try some form of socialism. And I think that in the first world countries, however, we have not. And this is an important piece of the puzzle. I think the working people in first world countries have to make up their minds. Do they want to join the stream of humanity going towards socialism, or do they want to somehow join their capitalist classes in waging wars and cold wars and new cold wars and technology wars against these countries that are attempting some form of socialism on the conceit that somehow these are authoritarian economies, etc. I could say a lot more, but I hope I've given some food for thought and we can have a discussion. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Radhika. Now we have an opportunity to pose questions and make comments. Those who are viewing this on YouTube will have to send us their questions by email. Send a message to global.justice.clip@gmail.com, and I'll pass your question or comment on to the Zoom room. And those of us who are in the Zoom room, of course, can pose our questions directly. So let me open the, raise your hand, wave at me, and so I can call on you. Who would like to raise a question? Okay, Jürgen Hollers.
Thank you, Cliff. Thank you, Dr. Desai, for the interesting lecture. I was just curious, when you mentioned about the imperialistic grab, I cannot help but think of China. China seems to be progressing magnificently when you think about the last 50 years of how China has developed for the well-being of its people. It's applaudable. But when you look at the Silk Road Initiative and you look at its position toward Taiwan and Hong Kong, definitely, I would say that comes pretty close to a kind of an imperialistic grab. And I'd be interested to hear your comments about Chinese amalgamism of Marxist capitalists joining somehow an imperialistic creature that I'm concerned about.
Well, okay, so I would say, first of all, that I personally don't think that China, and I've read a fair bit about this, it's very easy to say because China is extending its influence abroad that it is being imperialist. But I think that what China is doing is very different for a number of different reasons. Historically, China itself comes from an anti-imperialist tradition, and I think that counts for something. It has had to fight against American imperialism to this day in order to, and generally Western imperialism. So that's historically. Structurally, I would say that the Chinese economy is not reliant on expansionism because it is not a capitalist economy. Yes, it has capitalists in it, but it is not a capitalist economy. It is an overall managed economy which does not have the same impulses towards expansion as capitalist economies do. And so in that sense, it's a very, very different type of economy. Its financial system is different, its productive system is different, etc. And then finally, I would say that there is a third set of circumstances which also relates to the failures of Western imperialism, because while, of course, I certainly put the United States and its role very centrally in any account that I gave of what's going on today, I also underline at the same time that the United States' aim of essentially replacing you see, in the early 20th century, the United States looked at the UK, at Britain, and said, look, they are weakening. The hold of the UK and sterling over the world system is weakening, and we are going to replace them. In the new century, we are going to replace them, and we are going to make the US will become the leading country, as they saw it, the managing segment of the world economy, and the dollar will become its currency. This enterprise has never succeeded. And we can discuss how, but this has never succeeded. It has gone from one volatile set of arrangements to another, but it has never succeeded. And the reason for that is very simple, because the history of world capitalism, thanks to uneven and combined development, particularly the answering logic of combined development, whose impulse is anti-imperialist, has been to spread productive power around the world. And with productive power goes other forms of power, which means that we live in an era when Western imperialism already was not possible. American imperialism has failed in every sense of the word. So today, for any country, so what it shows is that it is decreasingly possible for countries to impose their will on other countries. So, and then finally, one final point I would make is that in the United States, there is a really interesting thing which I'd like to tell you about. This is the Center for Africa. How does it go? CARI, China Africa Research Initiative. It's at Johns Hopkins University. It's led by this wonderful scholar called Deborah Brautingham. And they publish stuff every day which underline that you simply cannot view what China is doing in Africa, in Latin America, in the rest of Asia as anything like Western imperialism. I'm not saying mistakes are not made, but it is not the kind of enterprise of systemic domination as you saw attempted, at least, by the United States in the post-Second World War period. So those are the answers that I would give to your point. I think that China is increasing its influence, but I think it's all to the good. I think at the moment it's playing a leading role in essentially creating an anti-imperialist alliance. You know, back in the imperialism was at its peak in 1914. Since then, it has been rolled back. Decolonization rolled it back, although especially in the 1980s and 1990s, when the third world countries were doing so badly, it became fashionable to say, oh, well, you know, independence meant nothing, etc., which is not true. It is simply not so. I mean, compared to colonialism, even the worst performing third world countries did much better as independent countries than they did under colonialism. And, you know, we can discuss how and why things went wrong in third world countries, but nevertheless, they have reached a level of well-being and a level of productive and military power where they cannot easily be run over. The American strategy of sanctions hasn't even worked against poor little Cuba. And I say poor little not in a condescending way, but just recognizing that it's a small island nation with not a lot of resources, you know, to sell. It has worked even worse against Iran or Venezuela or where have you. So if you look at all these things, I mean, China is not trying to impose such a domination over the rest of the world. So that's why I would, you know, I mean, if you have specific criticisms of China, I would certainly entertain them. I'm not saying that China gets everything 100% right, but at the broadest level, I wouldn't use the word imperialism to describe China. And by the way, nor would I use it to describe Russia, although Russia does remain a capitalist country. Brazil, India, they all remain capitalist countries. So I would be a little bit more open to that suggestion. India has certainly tried to impose its will, at least in its own neighborhood, but that's another question altogether. Yeah, I think Mark has a question.
Radhika, first of all, thank you for your remarks. I look forward to reading more. And in fact, if you've already published any articles on which your new book is based, I would appreciate seeing those in the chat so I can go into more detail. My question is, I guess, based on a somewhat different understanding of what your talk would be about today. I think it was very, very informative and helps me better understand the current situation. But I'm surprised there no reference to Venezuela or Bolivia, which at least for some people represents an attempt to establish 21st century socialism. And I'm wondering both on your observations or comments on those two countries, and if you have time, as you know, anything you have to say about Cuba, more about Cuba, would be of interest. Thank you.
Yeah, sure. I mean, so first of all, I've just shared one of my one set of writings here, particularly the ones on the coronavirus and capitalism theme, which you will find here. And if you just Google my name, I've written a very long article on the current war on the Multipolarista website, Ben Norton's website. So you can, I forget what it's called, a long title, but if you just Google Radhika, Desai and Multipolarista, you will find it. So in terms of, well, first of all, let me say that, you know, Latin America generally and Venezuela, Bolivia, Cuba, Nicaragua, I mean, I think these are all attempts to try, you know, essentially Latin America and the pink tide there with Lula's victory, we are expecting it to be strengthened in a massively, considering that Brazil is such an important part of the world. I think this is all a sign of the United States' decreasing ability to influence events. Let me put it this way. You know, neoliberalism can be more neatly be divided into two eras. One is the 80s and 90s, when the United States offensive against third world countries, aligned with the IMF and the World Bank structural adjustment programs, debt crisis, etc. They seem to impose such devastation on so many third world countries, particularly on African countries, that you have actually, and then of course you got the disaster of shock therapy in the former Soviet Union and Eastern European countries. So at the end of this, in the new century, a number of things began to change. So first of all, I would say that particularly after witnessing what the IMF and the World Bank did to South Korea, in particular, an OECD country, a huge industrialized economy, the fact that it could be treated like some kind of third world country really made a lot of countries sit up and take note. It's a bit like what's being done to Russia right now, and a lot of countries are sitting up and taking note. You know, I'm not saying that, I mean, the world is perhaps, shall we say, a little callous. You know, Cuba has been suffering the brunt of sanctions for well, close to 60 years, right? And people didn't have the same reaction. But the fact that they could do it to a nuclear armed power, people are sitting up and noticing. So Korea had that sort of significance. And it's interesting that since the late 1990s, after the East Asian financial crisis, people don't realize this, but the loan portfolios of the IMF and the World Bank shrank. Third world countries were saying, look, if this is what you can do to even Korea, what are you going to do to us? Like, we'd rather not borrow from you. Plus, for a variety of reasons in the new century, thanks to the low interest rate regime that the United States was forced to adhere to in order to save its own financial capitalists at the expense of its own productive capitalists. Because of this, capital was actually relatively freely once more available. And so third world countries were not worried about it, and nobody was going to the IMF and the World Bank. They became sideshows. You know, in the 80s and 90s, nobody could talk without naming IMF and World Bank. By the new century, they had become sideshows. Plus, China, particularly after 2008, has become an increasingly important source of money. It's not as important, you know, I'm not trying to subscribe to the debt trap diplomacy myth, you know, which is once again being trotted out in the case of Sri Lanka. Sri Lanka has over $56 billion debt, out of which only $6 billion is Chinese. So it's about a tenth of the total. The rest of the debt is owed to first world countries and their institutions. Anyway, so as a result of all this, the loan portfolios of IMF and World Bank shrank, and more generally, third world countries became more assertive. So what's happening right now is that China, with the BRICS stuff, with Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, with Belt and Road Initiative, etc., but also creating alliances with other key countries around the world, it is actually recreating some kind of an anti-imperialist coalition of the sort that existed back in the 70s. If you remember, there was the non-aligned movement, there was the Group of 77, there was the, they created UNCTAD, and finally the culmination of all of this was the demand for a new international economic order. And I would say, in fact, funnily enough, I was part of another discussion just this morning with Michael Hudson and various other people, and we were underlining the same thing. A new framework for international economic governance is long overdue. And a lot of the signposts for where it should be, like what we should do, what we should institute them with, you know, at the end of the Second World War, Keynes had recommended for international monetary governance, Bancor, and an international clearing union. There was the Havana Charter and the need to create an international trade organization that would have involved a very generous set of trading arrangements, in which trade would have been for the mutual benefit of participating countries, not the imposition of some countries on other countries. So I would say that all of these things are pointing in generally helpful directions. And what does this have to do with 21st century socialism? I would say that, you know, so far we've known of socialism, you know, the two big revolutions that occurred, Chinese and Russian, occurred at two ends of a period of war. Right? The 30 Years crisis, the single world war, really, that was fought. One at the beginning, one at the end. These kind of great cataclysms, hopefully we will avoid. There has to be a better, more sane way of building socialism. And I would say that more and more, the empowerment of people and their demand for reforms will themselves lead to and require us to require the creation of arrangements within countries and internationally that will be conducive to creating economies over which there is popular and democratic control. And I think that that's where we have to take things. You know, right now, Sri Lanka had the good fortune of being something of a welfare state, but in constructing a welfare state, they neglected the productive base of the economy. You cannot do that. You have to combine the two. And what China is trying to do is trying to combine the two. You know, the Soviet Union threw in the towel, too bad, but China still exists. And I think that you know, and one of the other things we often forget about imperialism is that these countries, the Soviet Union, China, Vietnam today, Cuba, Venezuela, all of these countries are trying to build something resembling socialism. Not only like they're building it against two things. They're building it from a base which is already set back by the actions of imperialism. Imperialism has impoverished these economies. So their starting point is already like, they are starting behind, they are handicapped. And on top of that, they are building socialism against the unremitting opposition of imperialism. So on both counts, they have a lot to contend with, but they are persisting because, quite frankly, what the West has to offer, what capitalist countries have to offer is so awful that you have to build socialism. There is no alternative today in most countries, you know.
All right. Norma Harrison has a comment.
Hi. Hi, that was lovely. Thank you very much. Yes, more. I put a couple of comments in the chat. You might have not have time to read them, but just on top of what you've already said. Yesterday, we were talking about this with my Sunday morning church group, a Sunday morning at the Marxist Library here in Oakland, and which has been going on every Sunday, regardless everything else. And one of the comments that erupted from me, at least, is that the Cultural Revolution was, raged against by the more privileged people who were playing violins instead of washing dishes or whatever. And it has come that people are saying, the Cultural Revolution was a good thing to have happened. I benefited tremendously from that experience and that other approach, that educational factor in our lives, that we all belong doing everything. To me, it means all work equals all work. The idea of privilege by the job you manage to get from degrees and diplomas is not what makes you able to develop the world you live in. Anyway, so one of my comrades said, oh yes, Xi Jinping said good things about the Cultural Revolution. What we're about is about changing the minds and abilities of people actually to analyze where they are. Minds are so clouded. I'm constantly at odds with virtually everybody, even people said to be my comrades, because I'm smarter. I mean, if people don't go to the basics of what's going on,
Yes.
what causes that? Oh, here's this criminal. How did he get that way? Well, his mother was bad to him. No.
Well, I mean, on the Cultural Revolution, sorry, I did notice that you mentioned atomic bomb, and I just wanted to share a long piece I did more recently on capitalism and nuclear weapons, which you can download it from there in full text. Yeah, I mean, Cultural Revolution, it's funny, but I think you and I have a similar view on this, because I say, okay, probably lots of, I've only heard all the bad publicity about the Cultural Revolution, the Philistinism and the destruction of art and blah, blah, and so on. But the fact is that there is a sense in which I think that one thing that the Chinese Revolution got right in many ways was that you cannot separate intellectual and manual labor. I see these wonderful gardening tools behind you, and I just, we are gardeners together, because I also feel that if you don't work with your hands to some extent, then you don't really appreciate work at all. Like, and I think that the Chinese got that right, and I do think that
actually, I have to suggest that it denies you the opportunity to put your hands in the dirt.
Yes. And also, I think that somehow just book knowledge is not enough. When you learn how to deal with things, nature, whatever it is, whether it's woodworking or gardening or whatever you want to do, or even being an athlete for that matter, like somehow you're dealing with something real, then you learn something which is different from just book knowledge. Anyway, to come back to the Cultural Revolution, I have no doubt that without the Cultural Revolution, China would have very well ended up in the same place as the Soviet Union, because whatever you think of how Mao dealt with it, the fact of the matter is there were right-wing tendencies. And that only goes to show that in any socialist country, it's not like suddenly class struggle evaporates. No, until you actually get to the point where you have some sort of proper, stabilized, functioning socialism, perhaps even communism, there will be class interests, and societies will have to make conscious decisions about which way they need to go. So, I agree with you in that sense. And I think that also there is another sense in which the Cultural Revolution, much as we may think it was a bad thing, or I mean, I don't, but much as some people may think it's a bad thing, the fact of the matter is that the worst that happened to people was that they got rusticated. They got sent to work with the ordinary people, etc. But they could come back. And they could hold positions of power once again. They were not just executed, nixed, etc., as happened under the worst of Stalinism. And I think that that's another thing that has given the Chinese Revolution the longevity it has, because people have learned that there's something bigger than themselves. People have learned that there are the people out there about whom this is all about them. It's all about ordinary people in China. And that has allowed the Chinese Communist Party to retain the flexibility that it has in responding to various things. So, you may say, I often say, yes, there are big corporations in China. Yes, there are capitalists in China. Yes, they are quite
They
powerful,
don't run the country.
but they don't run the country. Exactly. That there is something bigger than even them that runs the country. And this is
Can I add something about,
please.
I know I'm now I'm trying to interrupt, about Russia. Russia, was attacked from the moment of the Bolshevik Revolution. It has been being attacked for 110 years. This is what's been going on. And in the 90s, the overturn, I haven't read the details ever because I've been so dismayed that it happened at all. The details of how it was subverted and underthrown by the imperialist world. But the people have been changed by their revolution. They're still there for it. It's still a revolutionary state. I mean, this last row under the leadership of Putin is from the heart.
Sorry, this last what?
This thing that Putin has led is from the heart. It's from the heart of the people. 80% of the people were said to have been supporting Putin. And if people read his speeches, which are totally dismissed by the Imperium, it's as though there's a bunch of stupid people living there, people who have had advanced study all their lives, that they're too stupid to understand. Yeah, they're too stupid to kneel to the Imperium. So they're still revolutionary. They're still ready for that.
I mean, I can certainly say, well, first of all, that I don't know about revolutionary, although I noticed recently that the Putin and the Communist Party of the Russian Federation are coming closer together, which is interesting. And certainly the influence of the Communist Party will increase. I think that as a result of the events of the last 4 months, also the influence of the oligarchs will decline in Russia, because Putin has to, in order to keep Russia in some kind of in the same state as before, to preserve Russia, Putin will have to transgress their interests in a number of ways. So that's already happening. Thirdly, I would say that ordinary Russians, certainly enough of them remain members of the Communist Party, that's interesting, and it's not just insubstantial force, but also they remember the horrible 1990s of shock therapy, when, from being an extremely highly productive, scientifically sophisticated, highly educated society, they sank like a stone. And I think that Putin certainly has taken it upon himself to restabilize Russia after that, and he was successful in doing that. So I think that that's where his legitimacy comes from. And I would also agree that, what people portray as, Putin trying to recreate the Soviet Union. I mean, this is ludicrous. Putin is not trying to, there is in Wikipedia, you will find under, I think, the breakup of the Soviet Union, you will find the information about a poll that was conducted in March 1991, a referendum, in which 80% of Russians voted to preserve the Soviet Union. But the presidents of Russia, Ukraine, and Belarus at the time, Yeltsin and his mates, got together and dissolved it. This was against the popular will. Okay, so fine. And then if you look at the countries that participated and that country of the Soviet Union and the ones that didn't participate, you can see the exact pattern of the little conflicts that have taken place in Abkhazia, in Ukraine, etc., etc. And so you will see that these lines were already drawn long ago. But anyway, I agree with you. I think that the current war, as I have said in print, I mean, it's a proxy war against Russia. I mean, look at it. The West is so hypocritical, it's nauseating, saying stand for Ukraine. What are you doing to Ukraine? You are destroying Ukraine, because quite frankly, there is no way out for Ukraine other than something resembling the Minsk Accords. But you refused it, you encouraged Ukraine and Zelensky to refuse it, and now you have destroyed half the country and you are saying that we are standing up for Ukraine. I mean, like, who cannot see through this? I think ordinary Americans see through it. That's partly why Biden's popularity ratings are at a record low. No, people know that he has created this problem. He has created the inflation problem, the gas prices and whatnot. So anyway, but no, I totally see what you're saying, Norma. Yeah.
Thank you. A pleasure.
And for me.
But the Russians were attacked by World War II, which the U.S. was complicit with. The U.S. rulers, the oligarchs from the U.S. were urging that Hitler march in order for him to topple the Soviet Union. And that's what's been going on. And that's what's been going on all the time. I mean, all the border states that Russia took military efforts on. It's the same thing. They were trying to hold together that preciously won revolution.
No, I would say that the Americans, you know, it's so funny, the story of America, of the United States, I should say. I hate calling it America because all my Latin American friends object to it. But the United States and the Soviet Union have such a strange history because, of course, the United States was a leading, it led the financing of the Civil War and everything, you know, into the 1920s. And the United States, even after that, refused to establish diplomatic relations with Russia until the Great Depression, when, unlike the other major capitalist countries, the United States had no colonies. So there was no way that they had this cushion to cushion the impact of the Great Depression. So they needed markets somewhere. So finally, at the urging of US businessmen, Roosevelt reestablished relations with Russia at that time, so that, you know, when they needed to. So anyway, I mean, the United States is, in many ways, you know, United States love to portray itself as this freest, most innovative, and most technologically sophisticated country. It's anything but. Right now, they don't even have the capacity to do what they say they ought to do, which is to supply arms to Ukraine. Just today, there is a big story in the Financial Times saying that the US and other Western countries do not have the industrial capacity. And this is despite the fact that the United States spends such a shameful amount of money on the military. And then you can't produce a few shells. I mean, what kind of military have you got? You know? So, yeah.
Oh, they refuse to die anymore.
Sorry?
Their mothers will not let them go and die and kill.
Well, that's another one of my favorite jokes. I say, you know, in this generation, parents don't let their children walk to school. Do you think they are going to let them go and die anywhere? But the sad part is, Norma, that like in all countries, actually now military service is a class issue. Only the lowest sections of the population end up in the military.
That's not entirely true. They'll point out their advanced person in the military here, and that they've raised to the being in charge of murdering people.
Well, okay, maybe the officer class is different, but yes, yeah.
I wonder if we could go back to a point that Mark raised earlier. Marx wrote extensively about capitalism, critique of capitalism, but had very little to say about socialist construction. And what we have seen in the last century is various experiments in socialist construction, from the Soviet Union to China, to Cuba, which is currently, experimenting with different strategies. Venezuela under Hugo Chavez, and we might even mention Tanzania under Julius Nyerere. So I'm just wondering, how you see these very different approaches to socialist construction, and what is the way forward now?
So first of all, let me just put another plug in for the International Manifesto Group. Our manifesto, through pluripolarity towards socialism, it ends with a set of demands, which are, I would say, I think, which people will like, because it's not just any old set of demands, haphazardly constructed. They are very well ordered in a kind of a clear theme, and it's just a couple of pages, so it won't take you long to read. So I've just shared the link here. And thanks, Cliff, you also shared it earlier. So that's one thing, is that I would say that at one level, to me, and I think for Marx, the thing was very simple. You see, capitalism says that if everybody just focused on producing value, namely making more and more money, somehow as a byproduct, everything we need, whether it's schools or hospitals or food or clothing, will get produced as a byproduct. But why do such a strange and roundabout thing? I mean, if you need schools, build schools. If you need food, grow food. So at one level, Marx just thought that the whole detour of value production, once it is removed, societies can decide for themselves, as they have done for time immemorial, what they should do. And in a socialist society, they will decide in a democratic fashion. So that's, at one level, it's very simple. At another level, it's not just Cuba and Venezuela and Bolivia and so on. I think that actually every existing society, even the United Kingdom or the United States, they already are enormous sectors of production that are not capitalist. Take the state sector, take the voluntary sector, take the family sector. How much do we produce at home, which we do not produce? When a mother bakes a cake for her child, she's not producing a commodity, she's baking a cake for her child. There are so many forms. And plus, it's not just that. There are publicly run electricity companies, transport companies, hospitals, sewer systems, you name it. All of these things are possible. And right now, we already have a capitalist system that is so debilitated that it won't produce anything with well-paid labor, with well-treated labor, etc. It has to find some place somewhere where it can get away with much less than that in order to produce anything. So the only thing is, we have to find out how we are going to produce it. And at some level, because every society that is trying to produce something is not only just producing that thing, but developing its capacity to produce things, I think it's okay to put up with a certain level of inefficiency. If the shirts we produce don't cost $2 a piece, but cost $3 a piece, it's fine, because eventually we'll get there and we'll also produce at $2 a piece. But you have to start somewhere. So I think if these understandings are taken aboard, then I don't think the question of how we create socialism is so complex. I mean, we will learn from each other. We will learn by doing. Learning by doing is the way of learning, basically. And finally, I will say one other thing, which is that I feel that many of I think what is the real obstacle to building socialism is the aversion to two things. Number one, parties, that is to say, political parties that are capable of taking power. I don't think we'll be able to build socialism without parties. This idea that somehow some loose network of NGOs and cooperatives and so on is going to build socialism, I think that does not take into account the fact that as long as there are powerful capitalist states, you have to deal with their power, because they will be. Like Norma was saying, the US tried to undermine the USSR has been trying that for more than a century. It's still trying to undermine China. The National Endowment for Democracy is still fomenting color revolutions, even in the heart of China, let alone elsewhere. So you have to be able to deal with that. And the second problem is, the second aversion that you have to deal with is the aversion to planning. I don't care how decentralized your wonderful socialism is, and I hope it is as decentralized as possible. But at the present level of technology, where all the efficiency gains are to be had by massifying production, you do need to have some kind of central planning authority. And without that, we are not going to get socialism. So that's at least the way I think about it. And this Marx puts very clearly, as early as his critique of Proudhon, I would say go back to reading The Poverty of Philosophy and take a look, because it is a gem of a work. And if more of us read it, we would not imagine that, some kind of dispersed set of enterprises, cooperatives, and so on and so forth is going to equal socialism. That's, as Marx would say, that's a petit bourgeois fantasy. So, yeah.
Well, unless there are other questions, I think we can wrap this up now with thanks to Radhika. Enjoyed your very thought-provoking presentation in response to our questions. Today's webinar, as well as past programs, are available on YouTube, which are accessible from our website, www.globaljusticecenter.org. I hope you'll join us again next week for a presentation by Andres Ruggieri on the self-management and the precariousness, the economy of workers between the pandemic and the crisis of neoliberal hegemony. Andres Ruggieri is one of the leading movement. You will join us next week for that. And
Let me say one thing. I put in the form that Radhika put in about the long shadow of Hiroshima just leads to her computer. So I put in an internet connection. If I don't know how much it works. I wasn't able to follow through on it, but I put in an internet. By the way, it's the Democrat Party that bombed Hiroshima. That also,
that's surprising, Noma. You should be able to click it and get the actual PDF. But if anybody wants it, just email me here and I'll send you whatever you want. Yeah, any of my writings. I'll just put my email address here.
Right.
Yeah, well, I'll leave the chat open for those who want to read what has been put there. But now let me give thanks to our webinar team, Liz Mastras, Gregory Demon, Roberto Robles, Olivia Canales, Bob Stone, Betsy Bowman, and myself. And now this is Cliff Duran signing off until next Monday.
Bye, everyone.
Thank you.
Thanks for coming. Bye-bye.